Clint Eastwood was quietly sipping his coffee when a young waiter sneered, "We don't serve just anyone here." The restaurant chuckled, expecting the old man to walk out humiliated. They had no idea who they were disrespecting. But Clint didn't argue. He simply smiled. What he did next turned the entire place upside down, ruined one man's career, and left the world speechless. Stay till the end, because this story is one you'll never forget. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The mate d' barely spared a glance at the quiet old man sitting alone in the corner booth. To him, he was just another nobody, an outsider in a restaurant filled with Hollywood's elite. If only he had known this moment would change everything. Le Chateau, one of Beverly Hills' most exclusive restaurants, was alive with the murmur of powerful conversations. At one table, a billionaire tech CEO sipped expensive wine while discussing investments. A few feet away, an A-list actress laughed at something her director said. Every guest here was someone, except apparently for the rugged old man in the corner. Clint Eastwood sat alone, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. Unlike the others, he wasn't dressed in designer suits or flashy watches. Instead, he wore a simple dark jacket, well-worn jeans, and a pair of leather boots that had clearly seen their share of dust. His cowboy-like presence felt out of place in this world of polished excess. That's why Jason, a young and arrogant waiter, had already decided he didn't belong. Jason strutted across the restaurant with a confidence that came from serving only the most influential people in the city. His neatly pressed uniform and slicked-back blonde hair gave him the appearance of a man who thought he owned the place. And in some ways he did. After all, it was his job to decide who was worth serving. Stopping by Clint's table, Jason took a slow, deliberate glance at him, lips curling in a smirk. "Are you lost, sir?" he asked, his voice laced with fake politeness. "We have a very specific clientele here." Clint didn't look up. He just took a slow sip of his coffee, his face unreadable. Jason sighed dramatically, already irritated. "Look, I don't want to be rude, but..." He grabbed the menu from Clint's table without asking. His smirk widened as he pulled it away. "We don't serve just anyone here." A few nearby guests chuckled. Someone at a nearby table whispered, "Oh, this should be good." Still, Clint didn't react. Jason waited for embarrassment, maybe a protest. But instead, Clint finally moved, slowly lifting his head. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Jason's with a cold, steely gaze. The playful smirk on Jason's face faltered just slightly. Then Clint spoke, low, steady, and dangerous. "Son, you just made a big mistake." Jason felt an involuntary shiver crawl up his spine. But he wasn't backing down yet, not until it was too late. Jason thought he was humiliating an old man. He had no idea he was digging his own grave. The laughter spread across Le Chateau like wildfire, each chuckle dripping with condescension. The wealthy patrons, adorned in designer suits and sparkling jewelry, smirked as they watched the so-called nobody in the corner become the night's entertainment. Clint Eastwood, however, remained completely unbothered. He didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't even blink. He simply picked up his coffee and took another slow sip, as if Jason wasn't worth the effort of a response. Jason, emboldened by the reaction from the guests, puffed out his chest. He liked an audience, and right now everyone in that room was watching him. "You know," Jason sneered, tilting his head, "I think you might be a little lost, sir." He waved toward the door, his smirk widening. "There's a diner just a few blocks down, much more suited to your kind." A burst of laughter erupted from a nearby table. A wealthy couple, an older man in a navy blue suit and a woman draped in diamonds, leaned in, entertained. The woman giggled, sipping her champagne. "Oh dear," she whispered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is Beverly Hills, not the Wild West." Her husband chuckled along. "I didn't know they let cowboys in here." More laughter followed, more whispers, more eyes watching. But Clint, he didn't react. He simply set his coffee cup down ever so gently, his fingers tapping lightly on the rim. The tiniest of sounds. Click, click, click. Jason, mistaking Clint's silence for submission, turned to the maitre d' with a smirk. "Maybe we should start charging an entry fee to keep people like him out." A few feet away, a young busboy stopped mid-step. His tray wobbled in his hands and his eyes widened as he recognized the man sitting in the corner. His breathing hitched, panic flashing across his face as he turned toward Jason. "Jason!" the busboy hissed in stepping closer. That's... Jason waved him off without a glance. Relax, he muttered. I've got this handled. The busboy swallowed hard. No, you really don't. Meanwhile, Clint finally moved, just slightly. He shifted forward in his seat, his rugged face calm, but his cold blue eyes locked onto Jason like a sniper taking aim. Then he spoke. You sure you want to finish that sentence? Jason felt a shiver crawl down his spine, but his ego was too big to back down, and that was his second mistake. The entire restaurant was now watching, expecting the old man to leave humiliated. A hush fell over Le Chateau, but it wasn't the kind of silence that came from respect. It was the kind that came before a spectacle. The wealthy diners, dressed in silk and cashmere, leaned forward in their seats, eager to see how this scene would unfold. Some whispered behind manicured hands, others nudged their companions. And then, almost like a signal, the glow of smartphone screens flickered to life. People had started recording. This wasn't just dinner anymore. This was entertainment. Clint Eastwood, still seated, still unbothered, lifted his coffee cup and took another slow, deliberate sip. His hands didn't shake. His posture didn't tense. If anything, he looked bored. Jason, standing tall, mistook Clint's lack of reaction for submission. A smirk crawled across the young waiter's lips. He turned toward the nearest guest, playing to the audience like an actor in a well-rehearsed play. Ladies and gentlemen, Jason announced, voice dripping with mock politeness, I do apologize for the disturbance. He gestured toward Clint with a condescending chuckle. It seems we have someone here who doesn't quite understand where he is. A snobby woman at a nearby table scoffed loudly, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. Oh, for heaven's sake, she sighed. Can someone just tell him to stop embarrassing himself? Jason grinned, encouraged by her words. You heard the lady, old man, Jason said, placing both hands on Clint's table and leaning in. This place isn't for people like you. The murmurs of agreement rippled through the restaurant. A few guests chuckled. Others shook their heads in disapproval, waiting for the moment Clint would stand up and walk out with his tail between his legs. But Clint, he still didn't move. Instead, he set his coffee cup down with a quiet clink against the saucer, exhaled softly, and finally, looked up. His steely blue eyes met Jason's with a coldness so sharp, so unwavering, that for the first time that evening, Jason's smirk faltered. Just for a second too long, because Clint had seen it, and so had the busboy. But Jason, too caught up in his own arrogance, quickly masked the hesitation. All right, Jason said, straightening his vest and rolling his shoulders. If you won't leave on your own, then with a dramatic snap of his fingers, he turned toward the back of the restaurant. Security, get this guy out of here. The moment the words left Jason's mouth, the restaurant doors swung open. Someone important had just arrived. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted from mild amusement to charged anticipation. Eyes darted between the corner booth and the approaching security guards, their polished black shoes clicking against the marble floor with each step. They were big, broad-shouldered men, the kind hired to handle situations discreetly, efficiently, and with as little fuss as possible. Jason, standing with his arms crossed, exhaled slowly, a smug grin curling at the edges of his lips. He could already picture the headlines. Wannabe cowboy thrown out of Beverly Hills' finest establishment. He would tell this story for years. The two guards, one bald with a thick build and the other younger, but just as intimidating, stopped in front of Clint's table. Their towering forms cast shadows over him, yet Clint remained exactly as he was, calm, unmoving, and completely uninterested in the spectacle unfolding around him. The bald guard took the lead, his voice flat and authoritative. Sir, I need you to stand up and come with us. Clint slowly reached for his coffee cup, lifting it with the same deliberate ease he had shown all night. He took a sip, let the warmth settle, and only then did he tilt his head slightly upward to meet the man's gaze. I'm having my coffee, he said, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of someone who was not used to being told what to do. The younger guard tensed at the response. He wasn't used to people refusing their orders. Let's not make this difficult, he said, his tone sharpening. It's time for you to leave. A ripple of excitement passed through the restaurant. A few guests whispered amongst themselves, while others shifted forward in their seats, fully expecting a scene. Jason let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking his head in mock pity. See, this is just sad, he muttered to no one in particular. He turned to the guest near him, smirking. Old man just doesn't know when to quit. Meanwhile, in the background, A quiet but important action was taking place. The young busboy, who had been nervously watching the events unfold, slipped his hand into the front pocket of his apron. His fingers fumbled as he pulled out his phone and quickly typed out a message. His hands were trembling, his eyes darting between Clint and the security guards. He hesitated for only a second before pressing send. Jason noticed the movement and let out a scoff, rolling his eyes. "Oh, what's that, kid? Calling for backup?" His laughter was cruel, meant to embarrass both Clint and the busboy. "Hate to break it to you, but no one's coming to save you, old man." For the first time since the conversation began, Clint finally moved. He didn't rise from his seat, didn't speak a word, but simply turned his head toward Jason. The shift was subtle but powerful. His piercing blue eyes locked onto the younger man with an unreadable expression, calm yet dangerous, distant yet completely aware. It was the look of someone who had seen and survived more than Jason could ever imagine. Jason's confidence wavered for just a fraction of a second, but before he could react further, the restaurant doors swung open with a force that sent an echo through the room. The laughter died instantly. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The security guards stiffened, their professional composure shaken by the sudden interruption. Heads turned toward the entrance as heavy, deliberate footsteps cut through the silence. There was something about the presence that had just entered, something that made even the wealthiest patrons straighten in their seats. Jason's grin faltered. His arms slowly uncrossed as unease crept into his posture. The security guards exchanged uncertain glances, instinctively stepping aside. And Clint? He took another slow sip of his coffee, finally leaning back in his chair like a man who had been waiting for this moment all along. The last person Jason expected to see just arrived, and he looked furious. The heavy doors of Le Chateau swung open with a force that made the chandeliers tremble. The crisp night air rushed in, carrying with it a presence that turned heads and stole the breath from the room. Standing in the entrance, slightly out of breath but radiating authority, was Mr. Langston, the owner of the restaurant himself. His sharp, tailored suit was slightly disheveled, his usually composed demeanor cracked with urgency. His eyes scanned the room quickly until they landed on Clint. And then, he froze. For a moment, he didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stared, as if his mind was struggling to process what he was seeing. Jason, oblivious to the storm about to hit him, let out a smug chuckle. "Oh, Mr. Langston, perfect timing," he said, casually dusting off his vest. He gestured toward Clint like he was pointing out a stain on the carpet. "I was just handling a little situation. We had a guest who didn't quite belong here." Langston didn't respond. Jason, taking the silence as approval, continued. "I mean, look at him. I thought this was a high-class establishment, not some—" But before he could finish, Langston finally moved. His head snapped toward Jason, his face draining of color, as if he had just witnessed a man throw away his entire career in real time. "You!" Langston started, his voice hoarse. He swallowed hard, his eyes flicking back to Clint, who had yet to say a single word. Jason, mistaking Langston's reaction for confusion, rolled his eyes and let out a low laugh. "Relax, boss. I handled it," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Told him to find someplace more." His speed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Langston's fingers twitched at his sides. His chest rose and fell in rapid, uneven breaths. He looked around the restaurant, as if trying to confirm that this was really happening. And then, in a voice so low that only Jason could hear, he whispered, "Do you even know who that is?" Jason's smirk flickered. His confidence wavered. For the first time all night, he felt something cold grip his spine. Fear. Jason, who had been so smug moments ago, suddenly felt the weight of his mistake. For a brief moment, Jason thought Mr. Langston was joking. Surely this was some kind of overreaction. He let out a nervous chuckle, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Boss, come on," he said, still holding on to his arrogance like a lifeline. "You're acting like I just threw out the mayor or something." Langston's expression didn't change. The older man's eyes were locked on Clint, his jaw tight, his breath still uneven. His reaction wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was fear. Jason's stomach twisted slightly, but he forced another grin. "Look, if you really want me to apologize to the guy, fine, Langston suddenly turned away from him, lifting a hand. His voice, firm and controlled despite the tension, echoed through the restaurant. "Everyone, put your forks down." The sound, of silverware clinking against plates filled the room as conversations halted. All movement ceased. The guests, who had been enjoying the show from the sidelines, suddenly felt the air shift. Some exchanged confused glances, while others, the ones who recognized Clint's name before anyone else did, fell eerily silent. Jason's smile cracked. His palms grew sweaty. "Wait, what?" he muttered, glancing around. He had been so sure of himself a second ago, so convinced that he was the one in control of the situation, but now he felt it slipping. A woman at a nearby table whispered something to her husband, her face suddenly pale. Across the room, a young Hollywood starlet covered her mouth in shock. A businessman in an expensive suit sat frozen, as if realization had just dawned. Jason didn't understand. He felt his world tilting, but he couldn't grasp why. And then from his left, a quiet chuckle. He turned sharply. The busboy, the same kid who had tried to warn him earlier, the one he had brushed off without a second thought. Now the busboy was smirking. Jason's mouth went dry. "What the hell is so funny?" he snapped. The busboy just shook his head, wiping his hands on his apron. "Man," he muttered under his breath. "You really did it, huh?" Jason's breath hitched. He wanted to say something, demand an explanation, call out the absurdity of the situation, but his voice wouldn't come. His throat tightened as Langston finally turned back to him. The restaurant owner exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. He looked tired, as if Jason had just given him the worst headache of his life. "Jason," he said, his voice low but heavy, "you need to understand something." Jason swallowed hard. Langston gestured toward Clint. "That man owns half this damn restaurant." The words hit Jason like a punch to the gut. Everything around him blurred for a moment. The restaurant, the guests, the hushed whispers. His ears rang. His body stiffened. He tried to process what had just been said, but his brain refused to catch up. All this time he had been ridiculing, mocking, and attempting to humiliate someone who wasn't just a customer. He was part owner of Le Chateau, and Jason had just tried to throw him out. His breath quickened. He staggered backward, nearly bumping into a chair. His mind raced for a way out, some excuse, some justification, but there was nothing. The room had turned against him. The people who had laughed with him minutes ago now looked at him like he was a dead man walking. And then, finally, Clint moved. With slow, measured intent, he pushed his chair back. The legs of the wooden chair scraped against the floor as he stood up to his full height, stretching slightly, like a man who had been waiting for this moment all night. Jason's heart pounded as Clint finally met his gaze, and there was nowhere left to hide. Jason's humiliation was just beginning, because Clint Eastwood wasn't just a guest. He was something much bigger. A thick silence had settled over Le Chateau. The once lively hum of conversation had vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. Every set of eyes in the restaurant was now glued to Jason, the same people who had laughed along with him, who had nodded in approval as he mocked Clint, now looked at him as if he had just dug his own grave. Jason's throat was dry, his breathing uneven. His mind scrambled for some kind of recovery. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe Langston was just trying to cover for an important guest. That was it, right? He forced out a nervous chuckle, shaking his head as if trying to laugh it off. "Come on, Mr. Langston. You're messing with me, right?" His voice wavered slightly and he hated how weak it sounded. Langston's expression remained cold, unreadable. He folded his arms, exhaling sharply through his nose. "Messing with you." His voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut through the tension like a knife. He slowly turned to the rest of the restaurant, his next words ringing loud and clear. "This man," he gestured toward Clint, who remained standing, his face unreadable, "isn't just a guest. He's not just some stranger off the street. He is our VIP investor. Without him, this place wouldn't even exist." A ripple of gas swept through the room. The rich couple who had mocked Clint's outdated cowboy persona looked mortified. A Hollywood director who had smirked in amusement moments ago sank into his seat. Someone dropped a fork, the metallic clang loud in the silence. Jason stumbled backward, his knees weak. His head shook involuntarily. "No way," he mumbled under his breath, eyes darting around for someone, anyone, to back him up. No one did. His confidence had drained completely, replaced by a sickening realization. He hadn't just insulted a random old man. He hadn't just denied service to someone who could afford to buy this entire place 10 times over. He had publicly humiliated Clint Eastwood. The weight of his mistake crushed down on him like a collapsing, numbing building. His arrogance, his smugness, all of it shattered into panic. Clint, still silent, finally took a step forward, slow, purposeful, measured. The tension was suffocating. Jason could barely breathe. And then, with the same unshakable calm Clint had carried all night, he leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice so only Jason could hear. "Now," Clint said, his voice like gravel underfoot, "let's talk about respect." Jason's legs nearly gave out as Clint's words settled over him like a final verdict. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Clint wasn't going to yell. He didn't need to. His next words alone destroyed Jason's life. Jason's breath came in short, uneven bursts. His once smug demeanor had crumbled into something fragile, something desperate. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the murmurs and whispers that filled the restaurant. He could feel their eyes on him. The same people who had laughed at Clint's expense now watched him with quiet contempt. Their amusement had vanished, replaced by something colder: judgment. Clint Eastwood, the man Jason had dismissed as a nobody, didn't need to raise his voice or even look angry. He was calm, too calm. He let the silence linger, studying Jason with the same measured gaze he had carried all night. There was no malice in his expression, only disappointment. Finally, Clint exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Then, in a voice that was quiet yet devastating, he said, "You had every chance to do the right thing, and you threw them all away." Jason's lips parted, but no words came. Langston, the restaurant owner, sighed heavily, rubbing his temple as if this entire ordeal had exhausted him. "I built this place on reputation," he muttered, his voice laced with frustration. "And tonight, you just buried yours." Jason's chest tightened. "Sir, please." Langston didn't let him finish. "You're fired." The words hit like a gunshot. A stunned silence stretched through Le Chateau, quickly followed by a slow ripple of applause. It started with a few guests, then more. Then nearly the entire restaurant joined in. It wasn't the polite kind of clapping meant to be supportive. It was final. A verdict, a sentence. Jason's face flushed deep red. "Wait, Mr. Langston, please, I can fix this." His voice cracked, panic setting in. "It was a misunderstanding. I didn't know who he was." Langston's expression was stone. "That's the problem. You shouldn't have had to." Jason turned wildly toward the guests, the people who had once smirked along with him. "You all laughed too," he shouted, desperate for an ally. But they wouldn't even meet his eyes. Clint, now utterly uninterested in the scene before him, calmly reached for the menu Jason had snatched from him earlier. He flipped it open, scanning the options with mild curiosity. Then, just as Jason's pleas dissolved into the background noise, Clint turned to Langston and said, "Now, about that steak I ordered." Jason's world had just fallen apart. But for Clint, the night was just getting started. Jason wasn't the only one facing consequences tonight. The moment Jason was escorted out of Le Chateau, the restaurant's once lively atmosphere remained tense, as if the weight of the night's events still hung in the air. Guests whispered among themselves, processing what they had just witnessed. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others discreetly glanced at their phones. Because, of course, the entire incident had been recorded. It didn't take long for the footage to spread like wildfire. By the time Clint's steak arrived at his table, the video had already hit social media, uploaded by multiple guests who had been eager to capture the drama. The headline was simple but powerful. "Waiter tries to humiliate a nobody. Turns out he owns the place." Within minutes, thousands of comments flooded in. People were outraged by Jason's arrogance, by the blatant way he had tried to judge Clint based on his appearance. This is what happens when people think money equals class. Imagine disrespecting Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood. His reaction? Stone-cold legend. Major news outlets picked up the story overnight. By the morning, Eastwood justice was trending worldwide. But while the internet was celebrating Clint's effortless takedown, Le Chateau found itself facing an entirely different battle. The backlash was immediate and brutal. People flooded the restaurant's reviews with angry comments. Celebrities who had once dined there distanced themselves, publicly calling for the restaurant to address what had happened. The once coveted spot for Hollywood elites was now under a glaring, unforgiving spotlight. Langston moved quickly. He issued a public statement condemning Jason's behavior and promising major policy changes, ensuring this would never happen again. But some people weren't convinced. As for Jason, His name became synonymous with arrogance and entitlement. High-end restaurants across the city blacklisted him, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. No one wanted to hire the waiter who had tried to throw out a legend. His career was over. Meanwhile, Clint remained completely unbothered. He didn't gloat. He didn't seek out interviews. He simply continued with his life, letting his actions speak louder than any viral headline ever could. But just as he was finishing the last bite of his meal, Langston rushed to his table, his face pale with disbelief. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, voice almost breathless, "you just got a personal request from the governor of California." Clint wiped his mouth with a napkin, took a slow sip of coffee, and finally looked up. Well, this just got interesting. The fallout from this incident was far from over, because now the world was watching. By the next morning, Le Chateau was no longer just a restaurant. It was a headline. Major news networks replayed the footage, breaking down every second of the viral moment. Jason's arrogance, Clint's unwavering calm, the moment Langston revealed the truth. Social media erupted, with millions weighing in on the lesson in humility that had unfolded in real time. But while the internet was busy dissecting every detail, a much bigger player had taken notice. The governor of California. While Clint enjoyed the rare peace of his morning routine, a call came through, one that even Langston hadn't expected. The governor himself had personally invited Clint to an exclusive event celebrating individuals who had made a significant impact in promoting equality and respect. It wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. This was about a much bigger conversation. Meanwhile, Le Chateau had no choice but to make changes. The backlash wasn't letting up, and with the world watching, Langston announced a complete overhaul of the restaurant's policies. No more unwritten rules about looking the part, no more silent judgments. Every guest would be treated with the same level of respect, regardless of their appearance. For some, it was a long overdue shift. For others, particularly a few elite regulars, it was met with disapproval. A handful of wealthy patrons openly criticized the change, threatening to take their business elsewhere. Langston's response? If you have a problem treating people with respect, take your money somewhere else. As the restaurant scrambled to rebuild its reputation, one person was scrambling to rebuild his own. Jason. Realizing that his name had become synonymous with arrogance, he attempted to issue a public apology. He released a carefully worded statement, claiming he had acted unprofessionally and had deeply reflected on his behavior. But no one bought it. The damage was done. The same people who had once cheered him on now called him out for only apologizing after losing everything. His words felt empty, his regret too little, too late. And Clint? He didn't say a word. He ignored every media request, every journalist hoping to get a reaction. He let the world draw its own conclusions. Karma was doing its job. He didn't need to interfere. But just as he thought the situation had settled, Langston approached him once more. This time, with an offer Clint never saw coming. "Mr. Eastwood," Langston said, choosing his words carefully, "I want you to take full ownership of Le Chateau." Clint raised an eyebrow, setting his coffee down. Now this was unexpected. Clint didn't just want revenge, he wanted real change. Langston sat across from Clint, his hands folded, his face tense with anticipation. The offer was out there, hanging in the air between them. Full ownership of Le Chateau. A chance for Clint to take control, to shape the restaurant's future however he pleased. But Clint didn't rush to respond. Instead, he picked up his coffee, taking a slow sip. The room was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone who had gathered to witness his decision. Langston watched him closely, waiting for the inevitable handshake, the sealing of the deal. But then Clint set his cup down and shook his head. "No." Langston blinked. I'm sorry." Clint exhaled, his voice calm but firm. "I don't need a restaurant," he said. "I don't need to own Le Chateau to prove a point." Murmurs spread through the room. Some of the restaurant's staff exchanged glances, confused. Why would he turn down something so valuable? Langston leaned forward. "Mr. Eastwood, But Clint raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "I'll tell you what I do want." The room stilled. Even the servers who had been lingering in the background froze, hanging on his words. Clint's gaze didn't waver. "For the next year, I want this restaurant to donate meals to the homeless. No strings, no PR stunts, just real consistent meals for people who need them." Langston's jaw tensed, but it wasn't hesitation. It was awe. The restaurant owner exhaled sharply, then slowly nodded. Done! The news spread within hours. Headlines flooded the internet. Clint Eastwood refuses restaurant own. Or ship, chooses to feed the homeless instead. The reaction was instant. Praise poured in from all over the world. People admired his decision, calling it a masterclass in humility. Some even dubbed it the Eastwood effect, a moment where power was used for something greater than personal gain. Meanwhile, Jason had completely vanished. His half-hearted apology had done nothing to repair his reputation. Social media had turned against him, and rather than fight a losing battle, he quietly deleted his accounts, disappearing from public view. He had gone from an arrogant, untouchable employee to a cautionary tale. And Clint? He remained silent throughout it all. No interviews, no victory lap. But finally, after days of media speculation, he gave a single statement to a journalist who managed to catch him outside a coffee shop. He adjusted his hat, glanced at the camera, and simply said, "Respect isn't about money. It's about how you treat people when no one's watching." The world fell silent for a moment, because everyone knew he was right. Clint didn't need to yell. He didn't need to fight. He just let his actions speak louder than words. The world was still buzzing over Clint's decision. Social media was flooded with praise. News anchors dissected every moment of the viral incident, and Le Chateau had transformed from a controversial restaurant to a national symbol of change. Yet through it all, Clint remained the same. He didn't seek attention. He didn't do interviews. He didn't need to. But the world wanted to hear from him. So when a journalist caught up with him outside a small cafe, far from the spotlight of Beverly Hills, Clint didn't turn them away. He simply paused, adjusting the brim of his hat as the camera started rolling. "Mr. Eastwood," the reporter began, holding out a microphone. "What's the biggest lesson you took from all of this?" For a moment, Clint said nothing. He took a slow sip of coffee, his gaze distant, thoughtful. Then, with his signature calm, he looked up and said, "People show their true colors when they think no one's watching." The words were simple, but they hit like a hammer. The video exploded online. Within hours, it had millions of views. In days, that number climbed past 50 million. People weren't just sharing the clip. They were quoting it. People show their true colors when they think no one's watching. It became more than a statement. It became a mantra. Companies printed it on posters. Motivational speakers used it in seminars. Celebrities tweeted it. The message resonated because it was true. Meanwhile, Le Chateau had undergone a complete transformation. The restaurant, once known for its exclusivity and judgment, had become a beacon for inclusivity and respect. Guests from all walks of life dined there now, not because of how they dressed, but because of who they were. And Jason? He had disappeared from the spotlight. No more social media. No more public statements. No more desperate attempts to salvage his reputation. But one day, a sharp-eyed customer spotted him. At a fast food chain, Jason was working the counter, his head down, his once cocky demeanor replaced by quiet shame. As the customer approached, Jason never looked up. He refused to make eye contact, because now he knew what it felt like to be judged.